All right. Добрий день. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Archives Volunteer Program, Principles, Design, and Workflow. I'm Marina Chernevska, I'm your host for today. This webinar is brought to you by a joint initiative between the Ukrainian Canadian Congress National Archives Committee and the Sustainable Ukrainian Canadian Heritage Program at the Kulfoko Center at the University of Alberta. A few housekeeping items before we start. This webinar is being recorded and it will be made available online on a YouTube channel. Everyone who registered in the workshop will receive a notification when it's posted. We will also be able to share slides with you. If you have any questions to the presenter, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to type those questions. You can also use chat to introduce yourself, let us know where you come from, or for general comments during the presentation. Presentation will take approximately 40 minutes, and then we will have ample time for questions and comments and discussion. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce the instructor of today's workshop, Andriy Chernevich. Andriy is the archivist at the Gold Museum and Archives in Lethbridge, Alberta. He is a graduate of the Ukrainian Folklore Program at the University of Alberta, and he's also a member of the National Archives Committee of the UCC. Over to you, Andriy.
Thank you, Marina, and thank you for inviting me to organize such a program. I think that's a very important subject for us to discuss because it is a solution for some things. And before I start talking about the subject matter, I would like to say to describe where I'm coming from. So I'm an archivist in the Gold Museum and Archives in Lethbridge, Alberta, and what I'm sharing with you is based on about 10 years of experience with a volunteer program here at the Gold. And so over that time, I've been managing from 6, 7 to 12 volunteers at a time. And I haven't created the program. I inherited it from my predecessor, but I modified it as I interacted with volunteers, and I saw some ways to improve that. So I'm going to share my screen right now with some slides, and we'll keep all the questions towards the end. Okay, I hope you can see the first slides. It says Archives Volunteer Program over there. Okay, first, the challenge of inadequate resources is the reality for all small and medium-sized archives anywhere. So they often lack staff and crippled with workload, and archivists are always under pressure to meet professional standards, as well as demands of the parent organization and users. Normal duties of an archivist include many things, and I'm going to just go to the next slide to show you just some things that I included based on the duties of my position, and they include research requests, which is reference service, accessioning and processing records, digitization program, media outreach, exhibits, administrative duties, and more. So there might be more things on that pie chart, and that takes all the time, and many things have to be put on the back burner, and yeah, it's difficult to handle it all. And this is considering that small and medium-sized archives cannot afford contract help, which is very often the case with the larger organizations like the Provincial Archives and Library and Archives Canada. So it's just simply not in the budget. So this situation creates work stress and backlogs. And as you might know, backlogs can be years and sometimes decades back, just sitting there waiting to be some papers just waiting to be processed. So one way, and probably the only way, as far as I know, to handle the challenge is to create an advanced volunteer program and to learn how to delegate. It takes time and effort, but it can be a game changer in the long run. A volunteer program can ease the pressure on the archivist with more things accomplished, and while creating an engagement for community members, for the volunteers. So it's a win-win-win situation if done right. It requires a good system put in place, and a system that includes, among other things, screening of volunteers, training, assignment of tasks, establishing procedures, supervision, and quality control. And we'll move right now to, yes, so all those things create stress. So right now, before I proceed any further, I would like to get something out of the way because it needs to be pointed out. A volunteer program needs a proper foundation, and the cornerstone is the position of archivist. Your organization has to have somebody who is full-time responsible for the archives operation, somebody who is in charge of managing the volunteer program, because the program will not manage itself or will not be successfully managed by a committee of staff or other volunteers, because that's a recipe for a dysfunctional program. You need a dedicated person with some training. A volunteer program cannot be a substitute for an archivist. It just enhances his or her productivity. So you might ask, okay, so how do we get such a person, dedicated person? Well, it's not the focus of this presentation because it's a project in itself. Creating a staff position or attracting a committed, maybe retired community member as a volunteer. A paid full-time position is certainly the best, but sometimes one has to go with a dedicated volunteer archivist with some incentives and some training. Therefore, moving forward in this presentation, I assume that you have such a dedicated person in your organization who can develop and oversee a group of volunteers. So from my experience, there are only certain things that can be reliably and successfully delegated. Not everything can be delegated. There are relatively straightforward tasks, including labeling, digitization, and data entry. And at the GALT, we have all those tasks delegated to volunteers. And I've seen other archival organizations do the same. It's a matter of creating clear instructions and supervision, and of course, having the proper equipment for doing that. For more advanced tasks, I would single out arrangement and description as something that you can delegate. It's somewhat tricky because it requires some training and experience, but it's doable. From my experience, it is doable. For those of you who are not familiar with what arrangement description means, It's one of the core archival duties, and it's about establishing physical and intellectual control over the records. So in lay terms, having the papers sorted out, boxed, cataloged, and rendering them searchable. So that's what I'm talking about when I say arrangement description. So normally, this operation is done by archivist himself or herself. But it's one thing about that operation, it's incredibly time consuming. And it's a challenge for smaller and medium-sized archives, because archivists in those organizations, they have very minimal staff, and they have to perform all-around duties, including the arrangement description. So in my presentation, I will be dedicate some attention to both types of duties or tasks. The regular ones, which includes labeling, scanning, and data entry, and the advanced tasks, which is essentially arrangement description. So first, the program starts with selecting volunteers. And some of you might already have people who volunteer at the archive, so some of you might need to recruit new people. And the typical archives volunteers, they from my experience, they're either students or seniors. And these two groups have different interests, expectations, and things that motivate them. So students typically are drawn by interest in history and career benefits. They certainly want a line in the resume, but they also want an fulfilling experience that would help them understand what they want in life. What do they want to work in heritage industry, for example? And at the Gold Archives, we largely have university students because we have a University of Lethbridge in town. And they mostly volunteer as part of the Applied Studies program. And Applied Studies program is when volunteering becomes part of the studies. So it's arranged like a practicum for students. They basically receive credits for doing that volunteering. There are certain requirements to fulfill and certain educational goals. So it's a course in itself. And I've had experience with students for the last 10 years, probably about a dozen. I supervised them in that capacity as applied studies students. Retirees, on the other hand, want an interesting pastime at the archives, but they also want social opportunities over there. And sometimes they would like to apply their professional skills. Because some seniors don't have enough engaging activities, and they also want to make contribution to the community. So they want to be engaged and they want to be appreciated. And they often don't mind taking on some time-consuming, tedious tasks. And if that's interesting for them, and there is enough variety and flexibility over there for them. And at the Gold, we're lucky to engage, for example, 2 retired librarians as volunteers. And yeah, I know, very lucky for us to have that opportunity, and we're glad to put their experience and skills to work for the benefit of the archives. And one of them manages our reference library at the archives, and the other one deals with our map collection. Another important differentiation between volunteers is that no matter whether students or retirees, is that some gravitate towards routine tasks with interesting content, like images and documents, while other volunteers are not satisfied with those mundane, repetitive tasks, and they need more challenge. So that's an important distinction. And arrangement description is a good choice for the volunteers who need more challenge. And they often have some considerable experience and background in history, education, library, or social studies. Both groups, however, need to display meticulous nature, stamina, and appreciation for records. Sometimes this match or mismatch between interest and nature of duties can be crucial. For example, when I started over at the Galt, I had one volunteer, his name is Bill, who was really fed up with just data entry and was ready to drop out. But then I tried him on arrangement description that is by nature is more has more variety and has a research element to that, and he liked it very much, and he stayed and even increased his hours, so that was more along his avenue. And applied studies students are premium material. They're skilled and motivated, and in addition, the supervisor can select the best of them, because sometimes you have a competition, and you can choose the best candidate, and also. And my colleague on the museum side does it regularly, because there are more students who apply than internship places. And because it's an educational placement, you can also exercise control through academic requirements. So that means that if students sign up for volunteering, they cannot just drop and not show up. They have some requirements to fulfill. So academic strings attached. And for example, in the applied studies program, they have about 12 hours per week in the course of the semester that they are supposed to work at the archives on projects. So you can rely on those hours and know that you can create a plan for that. Now, the overall signing process. First has to be when a new volunteer starts, there has to be orientation, filling out some forms that collect personal information and terms of volunteering. And if it's a large organization, it might include police check, some forms from the educational institution, if that's an applied studies program. So there is some paperwork, and some of that actually to do with liability issues. And it's from the beginning, it's better to agree on a regular schedule with the volunteer, and those provisions can be modified and changed later, but it's better to agree on something right from the beginning. So at the Galt, the way we structure that is that we have shifts, volunteer shifts. It's a 3-hour time slot. And some volunteers, they just sign up for one volunteer shift a week. And some take 2 or more, some double shift. But that's the way we kind of subdivide those volunteering units. Another thing to remember that most volunteers have a seasonal cycle. At the Galt, we have a number of volunteers who leave for summer, usually in around April, May, and then come back to volunteering in about October, November. So in fact, it's a half-year volunteering. And yeah, because some of them just move away for out of town, some just do golfing, and so yeah, they're not available. And with students, obviously the cycle is tied to the academic year. In both cases, summer is a slow season for volunteers, and we plan our work accordingly. Now, overlapping schedule. I have to mention that as well. So we're talking about concurrent volunteer shifts when more than one volunteer is at the on site, and it's a bit of an art. Some volunteers want to be alone to focus on their task, and probably because they're not very sociable. And it's better to schedule them when other volunteers are not around. Some others, however, actually want people around to talk to, and it's part of the experience. So for productivity's sake, you want volunteers busy at work, but also you want them to enjoy themselves. Those social volunteers will do the best if they have company. So I would schedule them accordingly. And I would actually ask new volunteers right from the start what their preferences are in terms of environment. Now, a few words about training of volunteers. Regular tasks like scanning and labeling and data entry require minimum training, but there has to be at least an orientation and hands-on demonstration and written step-by-step instructions. Plus, you have to be around when they start so that you can provide guidance and fix problems as needed, because there are always problems. Sometimes the computer is misbehaving, they don't know what to do with it, they run out of supplies, and so on and so on. So for arrangement description, you need a more substantial training, obviously. Every volunteer receives a crash course that covers the purpose of the arrangement description, main principles and terms, for example, like font, provenance, original order, procedures, media types, formats, storage, supplies, safety, basic conservation, some of the subjects that are covered. And I provide also written reference materials, so-called green binder, that there are 2 copies of them that I keep always at the work area for the volunteers if they need to look up something. And that includes various points like tips for arrangement, how to deal with photos, and how to deal with oversized materials, metal fasteners, so on. It's more of a reminder for them to refer back to the that original instruction. And sometimes more like a checklist of things. And that covers also how to do research towards to create the description. I was thinking at one point of creating a manual, but then I abandoned the idea because really volunteers don't like to read long manuals. So that's we are better off with just a binder with tips and reminders. So the whole training session takes about 2 hours, and we cover all those things, and in condensed forms they are found in that green binder. And afterwards, the volunteer receives a relatively simple and small donation to process, to start with. Basically, to put the knowledge to practice. And they go very slowly first and consult with me frequently. And once they get more confident, they work faster and they need less supervision. And it's good to encourage them to ask questions, not to assume things. It's basically learning by doing, and it's a big part of training. It's in a way, it's an apprenticeship of sorts with arrangement description, and they get constantly better as they go. And another important aspects that is part of the whole system is what I call quarterbacking. So it's about delegating projects efficiently. First, you have to do some assessment of both the projects and the volunteers, and so that you can distribute the projects in the best possible way. So in terms of projects, archivists should, and I'll just come back. Yes, that's the training. Yes, assessing the records first. You should beforehand familiarize yourself with type of records, volume, conservation issues, organization of records, I mean, and the provenance. And this review will allow you to properly assign this particular accession and provide good specific instructions to project volunteers to follow. And I don't do it every time, but if there is something that is can be a problem, or it's too complex to rely on the volunteers' experience so far, I just provide the instruction of what to do with certain type of materials or how to handle certain things, just for that particular project. Archivists should match the project with the best volunteer. Factors such as arrangement description experience, interests, background, and stamina come into play. So obviously, most challenging projects should be assigned to a veteran volunteer, while some new volunteers should start with easy, straightforward ones. Some volunteers have special interest and would love to deal with records related to their subject, like trains or military history or national parks or photography. And that's the best if you can assign that subject of interest to that volunteer. They're so much more motivated to go through the materials then. For example, in my case, I have one of the volunteers, Chris Morrison, who is an expert on history of the Waterton Park, and she wrote a few books on the subject. So she's a She's a historian of the Waterton Park. So I reserved any donations related to the Waterton Park to her, for her to process. And an additional benefit of such arrangement is that the archives really benefit from the knowledge of the subject of that person, because Chris Morrison's knowledge of the park's history is way deeper than mine, and her ability to recognize historical significance of particular items and put them into context is priceless. So I rely on that. Some records might be so complex and challenging that you might decide to process them yourself. Another category are very fragile items or psychologically disturbing content. So for instance, very recently, just a few weeks ago, I was alerted that our online database contains a series of graphic images of a traffic accident. I promptly brought those images down and started on the project of reviewing the database for this sort of images. First, I thought of delegating this task to one of the volunteers, but I dismissed the idea because I have no right to subject my volunteers to something that might be disturbing or cause psychological harm. And these days, there are even studies that suggest that exposure to traumatic records might be a sort of occupational hazards associated with archival profession. So you have to be careful there. Now about supervision and quality controls. Archivists should be readily available for consultation during the first few hours with the new accession, and most of the time thereafter. Volunteers is encouraged to seek help when he or she encounters a problem. This is that learning by doing process that takes place under direct supervision. And the quality of supervision matters because of the nature of work. Unlike some other lines of work, arrangement description is quite complex and nuanced, and one can never expect to cover all the issues right from the start. At the training, I introduce principles and the actual work, the actual practice show how those principles apply in reality, and or don't apply. And this kind of issue specific discussion is an excellent way to actually enhance volunteers' understanding of records. And we often have, like, if they have questions, it's not just a simple question. We're just looking at the actual records and sometimes just finding a solution for things. Like, for example, the volunteer come across a file, big file full of assorted newspaper clippings of all shapes and sizes. So what's the best way to handle them from the preventative conservation perspective? Should we leave them as they are? Should we bother unfolding each one? Should we put them into sleeves to prevent them staining other documents? Should we separate other documents? Or simply photocopy the clippings to get rid of the acidic paper? Or how about removing all the staples? Well, this is an opportunity to reason together and weigh the options. So myself, I'm a supporter of the common sense approach known as MPLP, which is an acronym and says a more product, less process. And this phrase and acronym was coined by the American archivist Green and Meissner. And the whole idea is to make archival processing more efficient and effective by cutting corners where doing so doesn't significantly affect the result. I know that many Canadian archivists don't particularly like that approach, and because they like to go strictly by the book. But in the real world, one has to consider things beyond the book, or rules of archival description for that matter, such as risks, benefit, cost, and time. Should one be removing every single staple versus using this time to quickly process a small but important donation from the backlog? You will decide ultimately whether it's worth it, but that approach, MPLP, has some good points there. At least consider that. So when a project is done, when volunteer is done, put all the files in their proper order, finish the research, I review the work. Actually, sometimes I review just their day work, if it's at the beginning of the project. And I look for things that could have been done better, mistakes, and so on and so on. And then I provide the written feedback that we discussed during the next shift. Then I usually check whether those mistakes were corrected and follow up. And finally, the project to wrap up. After arrangement description is finished, I transfer the description. They create it in a separate document and then submit it to me. And then it's me who actually put the description into the database. Then it's me who labels the boxes and put them away for permanent storage. I think it's important to keep control of database to prevent data loss and unauthorized editing. And the same goes for storage. So we limit access to storage just to archive staff, not volunteers. So overall, to wrap it up, 3 points about the proper volunteer program. Find quality volunteers, accommodate them, and give them enjoyable projects. Set up a good system, schedule, workplace, supplies, procedures, standards. And finally, control the process. Especially the initial stages, the assessment and distribution of project, and the final stages that I mentioned about the wrapping up and controlling how the information is entered in the database and things put in the storage. Constant supervision and quality control. And finally, I would like to address a few common concerns about using volunteers at the archives. The first concern is it goes usually like that. Volunteers cannot be used for arrangement description because the job requires a trained archivist. It's a legitimate concern. My answer is archivist only delegates simple and time-consuming elements of arrangement description, not the whole process. For this, for those tasks, job training and supervision are sufficient. Another concern is union issues. volunteers perform archivist duties can create problems in a unionized environment. So in this case, archivists delegate only elements of arrangement description and maintains overall control over the process. In this case, volunteers are only assisting, not replacing archivists. And finally, the first-hand knowledge. Delegating arrangement description deprives the archivist from first-hand experience with the records and in-depth knowledge of his archives, his or her archives. So, and the response is that archivist actually doesn't have to know intimately all the records in the archives. Archivist is more of a manager than content wizard who knows everything. So that's all I wanted to cover, and I would love to answer your questions.
Thank you, Andriy. I see you still have a few slides. Would you like to quickly go through them?
Oh yeah,
or...
I forgot to go through slides.
And if you would like to
basically
comment,
it's just those points that I was going through. Yeah, those are the sort of the conclusions.
Okay, thank you. We do have a few questions in the Q&A, but I would like to use the opportunity to ask the first question. And it's about while recruiting volunteers, you mentioned screening, and I was wondering how you do that, and also more broadly, how do you get to know people? Do you request their resume? Do you do interview to get to know them? And on the other end of this continuum, how do you reward them? Do you normally hold some events to appreciate volunteer work, or are there any other mechanisms to appreciate what they contribute?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And in this organization, because it's a not a really small organization, we're medium size. So we have some infrastructure in place, so to say. We have a special volunteer coordinator at the Gold who deals with all the volunteers who sign up. So he provides the general orientation and do the paperwork and so on. In our case, we already have a lot of volunteers, and sometimes we even to the point that we cannot accommodate all the volunteers who would like to volunteer. So there is sometimes there is a waiting list. So we have that luxury. We don't have to actively go and recruit them or kind of do some marketing campaign for volunteers. So that's a good position to be. I know. So usually the first contact person for volunteers is that coordinator, who later just asked me, I have such and such person, that profile, so do you have a volunteering place for him? Or he asks me or somebody else in the museum. For the rewards, we do have a annual event, volunteer recognition event. And that's probably the most significant one. I would say at the archives, I'm not sure how it works in other areas, but we have some small perks for volunteers. For example, if they request some prints of photographs, we waive fees for them because they're our volunteers. Then we have as volunteers, they kind of get a membership at the museum so that they can attend events and exhibits. Just small perks like that.
Thank you, Andriy. We have a comment from Anastasia Baczynski. To have a waiting list for volunteers is a lovely position to be in.
Yes.
So yes, I agree. Lenin Pollock commented that it's a very interesting presentation, well done, and she really likes this straightforward point by point format of the presentation. Thank you. And now to the questions. We have a question from Mary Human. Would teacher librarians be a suitable match for museum libraries?
Yes, I would say definitely. If I would think of several professions that are the closest to the nature of work that is done in the archives, librarians would definitely be one of them. Teachers, they can appreciate the educational potential of records, and so what I'm saying is that they have that appreciation of the informational value of the records and to how they can be used in educational context. Let's face it, a lot of materials in the archives they use in educational context, whether it's producing exhibits or creating programs or becoming part of publications. Yes, we very much appreciate people who have that understanding and appreciation.
Thank you, Andriy. I see a lot of questions that relate to conservation, preservation, general access, but we'll go through each of them. And
yeah, one by one.
If you'd like me to step in, I'm happy anytime. So do you still retain physical copies of materials after digitization?
Yes.
Absolutely, yes. Yes, I just... for those organizations that are unable to provide a full-time position, are there resources, crash courses that are available for volunteer supervisors so that they can proceed effectively as possible, if not outright professionally? And I think Archives Institute is worth mentioning, at least for Alberta.
Absolutely. Yes, that's the question that comes often in different situation context about what's available for archival education in the province. And for a quick but substantial one, the institute that is offered by the Archive Society of Alberta is by far the best one. It's a full course condensed into a week time.
6 days. 6
yes,
days.
6 days, and it's available on annual basis. It's around somewhere in the spring. Usually, it's traditionally it has been either Edmonton or Calgary. These days with the COVID, I know it has been offered in a distance form. Yeah, but I think once the things go back to normal, it will be again offered in that form. So it's like any other substantial workshop. It's somewhat pricey. It's $900, right? Around that.
About that, but it is absolutely worth it. And
yes.
ASA gets attendees from all over the country, not necessarily only from Alberta. And I also see announcements for job positions that require, if a candidate doesn't have archival education, the Institute as an alternative requirement. So it is a very, very good course.
Yes.
I would also like to remind that our committee did an introduction of archives, and the recording is available online. I will type in the link to the Archives Institute in the chat in a minute, and I will also send you a link to a YouTube recording of that presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Okay, next question. How do you set up a logical catalog system, and do I use specialized software or an Excel spreadsheet?
Yeah, I would like to say that cataloging is kind of a shorthand for arrangement description, because it's actually the term that comes from the library. stuff. So it's not very much used inside the archives, cataloging. I mean, it's just a kind of a lay term in a way in the archival field. So we more proper term would be arrangement description that involves the physical sorting of records and creating a description that is usually these days online and searchable, and helps users find the in records. And we use, archives usually use some specialized software. We use InMagic. It's a platform, well, it's a database that we share also with the collections. So it's a kind of museum database as well as archives database. And we, whenever a new description is finished, we enter it into the database and it becomes searchable, available, so everybody in the world can see it. And there are certain rules and certain fields to populate over there. And so every database is a little bit different, but essentially it's the same sort of information.
Thank you, Andrei. I would also like to add that the such network that I coordinate at the U of A, we do have a database for any Ukrainian Canadian Heritage organization. It's an access database, not a preservation, but if you have your descriptions or catalog, if you call it that way, we can help it make available to the wider audience online, and it does not cost anything to you. So please feel free to email me if you have any questions or interest in discussing that. Next question, more of a preservation type. Marking artifacts, pencil, markers, labels, where, standard location.
Okay, in our case, artifacts, it's more of a museum term. So we use the term records, and the records come in a variety of forms. They can be paper documents, they can be photographs, they can be audio cassettes or video cassettes. So that's the range of items that we deal with, either paper or some audiovisual items. So what we do on paper, we usually use pencil to put the accession number on it. If it's, for example, publication, we can put the accession numbers in pencil on the inside of the cover. If those are a file full of documents, we don't put accession number on each page. We'll just put it on the file folder. But I've seen actually some older, they tried to put it on each page. I've seen some files from the 70s and they actually went through that, but later they quit because that's too much work.
That's a lot of work, sure.
Yeah, so in pencil, and in pencil because it's not obtrusive, so it basically doesn't damage your record like the ink would go inside and will damage it. So it's for preventive conservation reasons. If that's a photograph, we would put it on the back of the photographs with a pencil. And sometimes you need a special pencil that can write on glossy surfaces, because the normal pencil will do not write on those. Then on some items, like for example, the VHS or Betamax cassette, you can use a permanent marker to write on the case, yeah, it's something that will stay over there and that will provide that accession number that you need for intellectual control purposes. Sometimes you just need two kind of, one is the black permanent mark, and another is white permanent mark, because sometimes the case is black. If you put it black on black, you won't see it. So basically that's what it is. And I know I'm not a specialist in museums, but I've seen it on the museum side that if it's some item like fabric or clothing, they would put a special tag on it and write it on that tag, not on the item itself.
Yeah, thank you, Andriy. Yeah, it's better not to keep pens in a general area. So pencils are the way to go in archives usually.
Yeah.
We have two more conservation related questions. I will voice them, or actually I'll just make them visible for attendees, but I would like to say that this workshop focuses more on volunteering, and the next workshop that we will be offering is actually about preventative conservation, about handling, about proper storage, that will be offered. We're still discussing the date, but it's either February or early March. You're welcome to email me if you're interested. Then once the announcement is ready, I will notify you, but we will also be advertising it through our usual channels. We have arranged with the conservator from the Provincial Archives of Alberta to do this workshop. So all the questions about the climate control, temperature, humidity, things like that, that will be discussed, as well as questions about how to handle fragile items, how to deal with old photographs, documents, and things like that. So I propose we move on to other questions that relate directly to Andriy's presentation. And the next one is from Larissa Stavrov. What precise forms of screening do you recommend?
Kind of pre-screening is done by our volunteers coordinator, so that so that we understand what motivates people to apply for volunteering, and whether it's something that we can offer. If we can offer them we can match their expectations, because we don't know what they expect. So sometimes we need to actually have a meeting and discuss what the potential, how much time they have, what kind of project they would like to deal with. Yeah, and going from there.
Thank you. And a related question, in which case do you require police check? From Lyudmila Pogorelova.
I know it's standard. It's standard for at our organization for any volunteer, and it's actually the same procedure as for staff. Basically, they request police check. It's a standard procedure.
A question from Kenzie Gordon. How many hours does it typically take to get a volunteer up to a point where they can largely work unsupervised?
If that's regular tasks like the data entry and scanning and labeling, I would say several hours, like maybe 2 hours, to get them oriented, get them started together. So I use close supervision and see how they actually do themselves and correct them. And then I watch them for a while, answering questions. And then from there, if it's a task like that, they are ready to go after several hours. And if it's arrangement descriptions, way longer.
Thank you. From Sonia Sokirka, I think the biggest question is what to throw out and what to keep. How do you assess that, especially for organizations? Is there any printed material available?
Yes. So basically what I think you're referring to is appraisal, essentially, because appraisal can be at the time of the donation, and you just have to decide whether you accept that or you turn it down. Or it can be a reappraisal of something that's already in your collection, and you decide that you might not need to keep it. So in both cases, there has to be some appraisal system in place. And basically, you decide based on your experience. If you don't have enough experience or you need outside help, you consult with more knowledgeable experts. And usually there is a paperwork to around that. You cannot just decide you want to get rid of some things. It has to be documented. And as part of the documentation, you provide the reasoning for that. So the reasoning can be all kind of things. It might not fit your mandate. It's a good reason. It might not. You discovered something that is actually from a different province or different country with no connection to your region and your mandate of your institution. So you conclude that that was by mistake collected or whatever happened there. So you can, based on that reasoning, you can decide that you dispose of those items. But you have to put it in a writing document. So there's be special forms. Sometimes it has to be signed by your superior who's oversees the organization. So that's one good reason. Another reason would be a poor condition. Well, for example, that some records are so mold infested or so destroyed that they cannot be recovered, and keeping them is pointless because they cannot be accessed for information value, or they create a hazard for like that mold infestation for other records and for health of the people in that facility. So that's another good reason to get rid of records. Yeah, sometimes it's just something that you offered as a donation is good. It fits the mandate, has good information, but it's too voluminous. You cannot just accommodate it. You don't have storage for that. So you might redirect somewhere else to the provincial archives or somewhere else, but you cannot take it. And that's another good reason for that. So there are multiple reasons. And so that's part of the appraisal. So what you're looking for is some guidance in appraisal. There are books in archival. I know that in that the American series on different aspects of archival work, there is one book dedicated to appraisal. I actually have it on my shelf. Just a second, I'll see if I can get it for you.
While Andrei is fetching the book, in Archiving 101, Irene and we were talking about specifically documents that are normally kept for community organizations when they decide to maintain their own archive. And there are other useful cheat sheets available on what is normally maintained. But as Andrei said, first of all, it depends on your mandate. That is probably documented somewhere. I see that there is a need for a workshop on arrangement and description because many questions are related.
Yeah, so that's the book. It's called Archival Archives, Selecting and Appraising. Yeah, that's from that American series.
Thank you, Andrei. We will, yeah, maybe you can, later we will send it with the slides as a title.
And I would encourage you to check that American Association of Archivists. They have a special page dedicated to all their publications, and this book will be one of them. And there might be other books that would be useful. So that's, again, selecting and appraising.
Thank you. There is a question from Claudia Polilek. Very informative and helpful suggestions. Nothing like experience to learn from going forward. Thank you for sharing your experience and advice. The question, do you require volunteers to sign a non-disclosure agreement or other method of preserving confidentiality of materials and decisions made regarding, for example, their true archival value to a collection? As this type of workplace discussion can be very damaging if comments are taken outside of the museum and may discourage contribution of items. How do you handle this?
Okay, so we're not sure. We're talking about the information that might be circulating inside the organization or information that is in the records.
I understand it's both. It's the content of records, but also the decisions that are related to these records, whether they're worth keeping or not, and things like that.
Usually things that are inside the organization, I can't just think of anything that is within the archives that kind of insider information that would be secret to the public. I can't think right now of anything, but inside the records, there might be some sensitive information, and I usually alert those volunteers who do arrangement description to watch for that kind of records. For example, medical records of person, some confidential information, maybe tax information, something that especially from recent decades, not from 100 years ago. 100 years ago, that's less sensitive. So that kind of information, and I advise them to alert me if that they encounter that information, and then we usually take measures to either remove those records or to do something about them. But that's
well, Claudia has a clarification, and basically she's asking why information relating to why items are not accepted or of low value, which is a bit different, I think. Usually the archivist discusses it with the donor, whether they are able to accept the donation, and if not, they should openly say and be transparent that it is not within the mandate. And sorry, Andriy, I'm just, of course, it's my opinion, but I'm sure we're on the same page here. So there is, it's all relative. If it's not valuable for this institution, it doesn't necessarily mean that the records are not valuable in themselves. So it's just maybe archivists tend to talk to each other a lot, and we usually redirect the potential donor to a more appropriate place, because we know more or less, well, we know better the mandates of bigger, at least, institutions, and we do talk to each other. So I don't think that there is something secret about why records were not accepted or why they were accepted.
No. It can be sensitive, but it's not secret. If at the time of the donation there is a discussion, and I sometimes can see clearly that we have to turn down that particular because it doesn't fit the mandate, or there is something else, some other reason. Or sometimes we're just offered items that we basically don't collect in an archival institution, like, for example, like books, like fiction books or magazines or encyclopedias. That's an easy no. And sometimes it's difficult to say that we cannot accept your encyclopedias, and I don't have a good place to advise you who would take them. So that's unfortunate, but that's what happens. And sometimes there are other reasons. For example, one of them is people realize that there is some sensitive information over there, and they just want to keep it secret. They want to keep it in the archives. They want to keep it secret, so it's not available to the general public. And that is contradiction of terms, because the reason we preserve things in the archives is so that they are available for the general society, for the general public, for researchers from anywhere. And so we can only keep something closed for a certain period of time. And that would be an exception even. It has to be really valuable so that we keep it for a number of years closed to researchers. but then after that it becomes public, so we cannot keep something indefinitely, and if that's the wish of the donor, we cannot satisfy it, so we have to turn it down.
Yeah, I would like to add to this that because we have a lot of students, graduate students working in our archives as research assistants or archival assistants. So we do have a form that we developed quite recently for them to sign, simply because they're not necessarily information studies students or archival students. They may not understand all the nuances of confidentiality. And considering how intuitive and intimate they are with technology, we had several cases when a student was digitizing something and posting it as they were digitizing it on Instagram, for example, which is not a problem in itself. As Andy said, one of the big missions, goals of the archives is to make records available, but the risk is taking records out of the context, because they may have totally different meaning if they're not contextualized within the phone or collection that they are part of. And it may be misleading or even dangerous, with misunderstanding and stuff. So we do have a form that we developed. We are still testing it, but we think it is important to simply voice this concern at the beginning of their employment with us. And as a follow-up, I have a question to you, Andriy. You mentioned that you have some paperwork to sign with volunteers, and one of them you mentioned is terms of volunteering form. So I'm curious whether you could expand a little bit on its content, and as a follow-up, would you be able to share a template with the audience here? Because I think it's something also very important to negotiate at the beginning of the someone's volunteering experience.
Yeah, it's probably I used the misleading terms. There is a general form for volunteers that is administered by the volunteers office. It's pretty standard, basically collecting personal information and things like that. And the terms are basically, one is scheduling. So we come to agreement on the schedule of those shifts once, twice a week, and for how long. And other things, it's just the oral agreement between me and the volunteers. So sometimes they tell me that for summer they're going away, and I give them that flexibility, so they just informing me, and that they there might be some special arrangements during the time of COVID. Some of them just suspended their volunteering because it's better to be careful, and especially if they're seniors, and we're talking before the mass vaccination. So yeah, is whatever special arrangements can be made, so it's not all formalized.
Thank you. Okay, one last question, and we have to wrap up. We still have a short announcement, but for now, from Yurko Sergeychuk, are there opportunities for funding grants at the federal, provincial level to hire an archivist, or at least help in organizing, preserving the archives?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So you can use grants to to get some temporary solutions. For example, you can get a summer student, for example, for a particular year, or an intern, or so you can get funding for wages for temporary stuff. And I've seen that in some organizations they use that opportunity to hire a student or recent graduate with some knowledge of archives, so that the person can bring expertise on temporary basis. So that can be a solution, but nothing long term that I'm aware of. There is besides the Young Canada Works, there is this grant specifically designed for non-government organizations. I forgot the name. It's a federal grant. I forgot the name. But
Now
it's
the summer jobs, you mean? The summer jobs program?
No, it's not necessarily summer jobs. It's the something like community something program.
Okay, yeah, that's the federal one.
Yes, that's the federal.
Yeah, it's escaping me. Yeah,
So
okay, we'll find it in.
Yeah, it's a basically project-based one. So if you have a project to do with archives, you can check that grant.
Yeah. Well, Young Canada Works in Heritage Organizations is an excellent program because it specifically targets those graduates who have information studies, usually degree.
Yes.
The problem is that it requires a supervision by a professional archivist. So that's a problem. And I know I witnessed when a community organization managed to receive a grant, but they were working together with a provincial archives advisor and another archival institution that has a full-time archivist to arrange supervision for that person because they could not provide that supervision. So I think that the first thing to start would be to go to your provincial archives advisor because they would know the resources in your province. And they would be able, many of them can do site visits, not all of them. I know funding is not equally distributed in different provinces, but many of them do site visits and they can come and look at your holdings and provide some advice. You can also try contacting us if we are not too far from you. We can also visit, the committee. We can visit and give some advice, at least direct you where to move from there. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, well, but and just to mention, another strategy is to build from inside. Find a dedicated and motivated person who is open to getting some course and education, like an institute, under his or her belt, and then have time to dedicate to as a volunteering, and then gradually building more experience and utilizing some whatever grants can be obtained along the way, and going from there. And yeah, that's for some organizations, that's basically the only way.
Absolutely. Yeah, we are working currently, well, we started quite a while ago, but we are working with a professor in library school here at the U of A to create a course on community archives that would include a practical component in it. So we would do the theory
Oh, that's
the
wonderful.
First half of the course, and the second half would be placements that we will help coordinate and will help supervise placements in specific community organizations. And I would like to hear from the audience if audience would be potentially interested in such a placement in getting a student, because we are still in the development stage, but I think again it's going to be useful. So if you think it's a good idea, please voice your opinion in the chat. And do you have any final words, because we have to finish at the time?
Yeah,
coming to
just the final word. If you have some follow-up questions, you can contact me directly at archives@galtmuseum.com. And if you forget that, you can go to the Galt Museum website, and there is the page that with all the stuff over there, and I'm there. So
yeah. Thank you, Andriy. Thank you very much for your presentation, for sharing your knowledge and your experiences.
You're very welcome.
Thank you to all the participants for your active participation, for your questions. I will send out a short survey after the webinar. Please take some time to answer it. It won't take long. Oh, and I'm really sorry. Igor Protsuk has his hand raised. He has had it raised for a long time. Igor, would you like me to unmute you, and would you like to speak?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wait a second. I'll talk. I just noticed. You can now speak.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
What about submitting material to, or guidelines or something along those to submitting material to larger archives like Archives Canada?
Mhm.
I mean, I understand, that they can probably accept or maybe able to accept a lot of material, but they can't give the in-depth commentary on some material that smaller archives can, because they just don't have the staff and they probably receive a lot of material.
They have the staff better than any of us, and they are very selective in receiving materials. They receive materials of national significance. So whatever you're offering them, if it's an organizational records or in the personal records, that person or organization have to have national significance and national activity. So you have to be able to argue that that's the case. They will not accept everything. Definitely not.
And that same goes for the provincial archives. They operate within the parameters of so-called provincial significance and however they defined it. And but your chances of getting something accepted at the provincial archives are higher than the Library and Archives Canada, because they just way more selective. And also regional archives often is a very good option because they are they have all their proper facilities like us. We operate as a regional archives. We have the facility and space for and proper staff and equipment for handling those. And we, in this case, if you donate something to regional archives, this way the records will stay closer to the community. They would be easier to access for community members, for researchers, and also depending on the archives, but I would argue you have a higher chances to get it processed faster in the regional archives compared to provincial archives, because of the volume of the donations of records at the provincial archives. And let's just say sometimes it can be difficult to handle the volume of the provincial archives, and in the regional archives it might be arranged and described way faster.
Just kind of as sort of an add-on question to that. It seems, I don't know, Andrew, if your archives are web accessible. But yes. I think one of the problems with a lot of small archives is that they do have a lot of material, but there's no way that the public can just generally search the collection.
Usually with medium archives like ours, regional archives, usually there is all the records that are accepted and processed, they end up described online and searchable online. Like in our case, we have an online database. The Medicine Hat has online database. Red Deer has it, and similar communities, they do have the online presence and searchability. So no worries about that. If we're talking about the smaller archives below this level, in most cases, they are not even called archives. They be museums or libraries or something like on that level. Yes, they often struggle with the online presence, but there are a lot of exceptions, and some of them just use general databases to upload their descriptions over there, like the our provincial database, the what's called
Alberta on Record.
Yes, Alberta on the Record. So basically, it's an umbrella database that can be used by small institutions to upload their descriptions over there and make their records searchable. So that's kind of, it's like you don't have to run your own database. You just participate in a larger database contributing to that, and essentially you achieve the same results. You're visible, but yeah, it's just cheaper and more
Just
simple.
a small comment, because I am a database administrator for Alberta on Record. That database is accessible to institutional members only. So you have to be an institutional member of ASA to have access to it, to be able to contribute to it. If you are part of, but you're right, you're absolutely right, that many small organizations or museums, or as Andrei mentioned, different cultural centers, they do not have capacity or resources to do that. And this is exactly recognizing this issue. We created the Such network, which is based on exactly the same software as all the other provincial databases in the province, in the country, sorry. And you can contribute your digitized materials, your descriptions to it, and make it available. And it's very well indexed by Google, I must say. So it's really very well discoverable.
Yeah, it's an excellent solution.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah.
Oh, no, that's it. I mean, I could spend the next hour asking more questions, but I think our time is up.
No, thank you for your questions. Those are good questions.
Thank you. Please feel free to follow up. Feel free to email us if something really urgent comes up and you really would like to know the answer. We will upload the video to YouTube and we'll notify you about that. And we'll also share the slides from this presentation when it's done. Yes, we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you. Have a nice rest of your day. Bye-bye.